I remember the moment I first saw him, though at the time I had no inkling of how profoundly he would impact my life. My name is Carla. I was 22 years old, married for just over a year to a man I once believed was my perfect match. My husband, Noah, and I lived in a small rented duplex on the outskirts of a mid-sized city. We had a cat named Poppy, a few pieces of hand-me-down furniture, and big plans for the future. He was enrolled in graduate school, commuting daily for classes, while I worked part-time at a local art supply store to help keep us afloat. We had very little money, but plenty of idealism. The world was wide open, or so we believed. It started as the simplest of coincidences. We had just moved into the duplex, and I knew no one in the neighborhood. Noah spent hours on campus, sometimes studying, sometimes teaching labs as a graduate assistant. I felt lonely. I'd grown up in a bustling family of 4 siblings, used to noise and camaraderie. Now I spent large chunks of time alone, outside of my shifts at the store, wandering around the quiet streets or tidying our half-furnished living room. My new environment weighed on me. Brown carpeting, chipped kitchen tiles, a thin living room window that overlooked a line of overgrown shrubs. It was supposed to be a stepping stone, a place we'd stay while Noah finished his degree, after which we'd both find better jobs. But the uneasy sense of waiting for him to come home, waiting for life to truly start, gnawed at me. One evening, I stood on our small front porch, looking at the overcast sky. A thunderstorm loomed. The wind picked up. As I debated whether to bring in the few potted succulents we had, I heard the rumble of a large pickup truck. I glanced over at the neighbouring driveway. An older, faded blue truck pulled in next door, headlights briefly illuminating the gloom. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a casual button-down shirt with rolled sleeves. He looked about 50, perhaps older, with silver at his temples and a face shaped by lines of experience. He disappeared into the duplex that shared a wall with ours. I remember thinking he seemed so self-assured in the way he moved, contrasting sharply with the group of college students across the street who came and went at all hours. Something about him piqued my curiosity, though I had no idea who he was or what he did. Days passed. I worked my shifts, stockroom to register to stockroom, half-heartedly greeting customers who rummaged through pencils, canvases, and acrylics. Noah spent even more time on campus, sometimes not getting home until late, too exhausted to talk about anything beyond the bare minimum. Our new marriage wasn't a battlefield, but neither was it fulfilling in the ways I'd hoped. Late at night, I'd lie awake, listening to rain or to the hum of the old refrigerator, feeling a restlessness I couldn't name. I missed laughter, missed conversation, missed a sense of wonder. I tried to fill the void with walks around the neighborhood or by flipping through romantic old movies on an outdated TV set. One weekend, I decided to tackle the backyard. It was a patch of overgrown grass and shrubs, separated from the neighbor's yard only by a leaning wooden fence. I'd borrowed an old push mower from a co-worker, planning to reclaim at least a corner of the yard so we could have a small space to sit outside when the weather allowed. As I wrestled the stubborn mower through weeds, it jammed repeatedly. My frustration mounted. Half an hour passed, and I'd barely cleared a quarter of the yard. Then, over the whine of the motor, I heard a voice calling out, "Need a hand with that?" He stood on the other side of the fence, the man I'd glimpsed earlier. He had on work gloves and held a trim saw. It looked like he'd been tending to some hedges. Up close, I could see flecks of silver in his stubble, a certain calm in his expression that offset his otherwise rugged appearance. I paused the mower, panting. "I'm okay, just stubborn grass." He eyed the mower. "That's an older model, right? Might need a sharper blade if the weeds are thick." He moved closer, resting a forearm on the fence. I'm Mark, by the way. I live next door. Carla, I told him, feeling a bit flustered by his direct gaze. I just moved in with my husband. Well, about a month ago. He gave a polite nod. I noticed someone new. Didn't realize it was a young couple. Let me get my trimmer. Shouldn't take more than 15 minutes to clean up that mess. Before I could argue, he disappeared around the fence. I heard the rustle of tools, the click of a gate. Then he reappeared at my side with a gas-powered trimmer. Within minutes, he had cleared more of the yard than I had in half an hour. I stood there, feeling embarrassed but grateful, offering words of thanks. He smiled, telling me it was no trouble. At some point, I grabbed a rake and tried to keep up, pushing cut grass into piles. When the yard finally looked semi-respectable, we both stopped to catch our breath. Mark removed his gloves, and I saw the calluses on his hands, the little scars that hinted at years of manual labour. I felt a twinge of curiosity. What kind of work did he do? He seemed so comfortable with tools, as though it was second nature. I offered him a glass of water inside. He hesitated, then shrugged. We walked into my small kitchen, which was cluttered with unopened moving boxes. I apologised for the mess. He waved it off. I've been living in that duplex for a while, he said, but I'm not exactly the best housekeeper either. Work keeps me busy. He didn't elaborate. I handed him water, which he gulped down gratefully, leaning against the counter. Something about his presence felt oddly comforting. He was quiet but not standoffish, confident but not arrogant. I noticed his eyes, a shade of grey that reminded me of overcast skies. When he finished his drink, he thanked me and left with a simple nod. I lingered in the kitchen, unsettled by how alive I felt after such a mundane interaction. That night, Noah came home late, complaining about a lab assignment, too tired to eat the dinner I'd tried to keep warm. I listened sympathetically, but my mind drifted now and then to Mark's face. His calm demeanour, his willingness to help a near stranger. I chided myself for letting my thoughts stray. Over the next few weeks, I occasionally bumped into Mark, taking out the trash, parking our cars at the same time, or coming home from the store while he trimmed his shrubs. Sometimes we exchanged a few words about the weather. Other times, just a polite wave. But each time there was a faint sense of recognition between us, an unspoken understanding that we were neighbours in a street full of people who rarely acknowledged each other. Our part of town had an odd mix of retirees, grad students and families passing through. Most kept to themselves. Mark, for his part, seemed content to exist on the periphery, living alone in that duplex, tinkering with yard work, or disappearing in his truck at random hours. Eventually, it was Mark who initiated a longer conversation. I was retrieving the mail from our shared front stoop when he approached, wearing a button-down shirt and nice jeans instead of his usual t-shirt and work pants. He mentioned he was heading out to meet a friend, but wanted to ask if my husband and I might need any help with bigger repairs in the duplex. Sometimes the landlord was slow to fix issues, and he knew how to handle minor plumbing or electrical tasks. I thanked him, mentioning that so far we were okay, but I'd keep his offer in mind. He lingered a moment, glancing at the mail in my hands, a stack of bills, ads, and credit card offers. Our eyes met. He asked me about my day. Something in his tone made me realise he was genuinely curious. It was startling how I found myself opening up. I told him I'd been bored, that my job at the art supply store was all right but not what I'd hoped, and that my husband was always busy with his graduate work. Mark listened without judgment, just nodding here and there. I heard myself admitting how I sometimes felt out of place in this transitional stage of life. Married young, uncertain of my path. He made a small, sympathetic sound, then gently changed the topic, telling me about the coffee shop he was heading to, how they had an old upright piano in the corner. I felt a fleeting pang of envy, imagining him enjoying quiet evenings while I wrestled with a sense of restlessness I couldn't quite name. Over time, these casual run-ins became a fixture of my day. Whenever I saw Mark outside, I'd wave, and we'd chat if time allowed. Little by little, I pieced together that he was 50 years old. He joked once that he had more grey hair than the local barber could handle. He worked as a freelance contractor, specialising in custom woodwork and renovations. He'd had a marriage once, ended long ago, and no children. He didn't offer many details, and I didn't pry. But there was a weariness in his voice whenever relationships came up, as though he carried old regrets behind his polite smile. I tried not to think about how often I caught myself wondering when I might see him again. It felt disloyal to my husband, even though we weren't doing anything remotely improper. Yet each day, Noah and I drifted further apart. We rarely argued, but the distance between us was palpable. He studied or taught labs. I worked short shifts and managed the household. Our shared moments felt forced. On the rare evenings we were both free, we'd order cheap takeout, watch something on TV, and go to bed, hardly speaking beyond the simplest questions. How was your day? Fine, you? Fine. As though we'd forgotten how to dream out loud, how to be enthusiastic about the future we once planned so fervently. The first time Mark and I truly crossed a boundary was a Saturday afternoon in early summer, when I noticed a small water leak under our kitchen sink. Noah was out of town at a departmental weekend retreat. I texted him about the leak, but he didn't respond for hours. Growing frustrated, I remembered Mark's offer. I knocked on his door, feeling silly and anxious at the same time. He opened up, hair slightly dishevelled, wearing a comfortable-looking hoodie and old jeans. I apologised for bothering him, explained the leak, and asked if he had any advice before I called the landlord. He grabbed a small toolbox and followed me over. Within minutes, he was under the sink, fiddling with a worn-out pipe connection. I crouched nearby, handing him tools. At one point, he needed me to hold a flashlight so he could see properly. I knelt, shining the beam of light into the cramped space. Our shoulders brushed. He muttered something about cheap washers, and I felt an inexplicable warmth rising in my chest. Eventually, he secured the connection, tightened a clamp, and the drip stopped. When he emerged, we both laughed about how cramped the space was. A wave of relief and gratitude washed over me. "Thank you," I said, maybe too fervently. He shrugged, smiling. "That's what neighbours are for." Our eyes locked momentarily, and I realised how close we were standing, just the faintest distance apart. My pulse picked up. I mumbled something about offering him a drink, a can of soda, tea, anything. He hesitated, then nodded. We ended up in my small living room, him perched on the edge of the couch, me handing him a cold soda. The tension in the air was subtle but undeniable. We talked about random topics, my job, his contracting gigs, the weird smell that came from the old building's vents. But the more we spoke, the more I felt an undercurrent of something neither of us wanted to admit. We were connecting in a way that felt more personal than two neighbours swapping small talk. When he finished the soda, he set the can down, and his gaze settled on me with an intensity that made my cheeks flush. I cleared my throat, abruptly offering to show him out. He took the hint, following me to the door, though I sensed the moment lingered. As soon as he left, I collapsed onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. My emotions tangled. Guilt, curiosity, excitement, dread. I was a 22-year-old married woman, feeling drawn to a man old enough to be my father. The thought was jarring. Yet the emotional chasm in my marriage was also real, and I felt a tug toward Mark's steadiness that I couldn't ignore. The moral lines were so clear in theory, yet in practice, I found them increasingly blurred. For a while, nothing outwardly changed. Mark and I remained friendly neighbours, exchanging polite greetings. I tried to focus on my marriage, cooking new recipes for dinner, suggesting date nights. But Noah was either too busy or too tired. When we did go out, conversation felt forced. I didn't mention Mark, partly because it never occurred to me how to bring him up, partly because a small voice inside me warned that I was tiptoeing towards something dangerous. Eventually, the pull became harder to resist. One afternoon, while taking out the trash, I noticed Mark loading a few sheets of plywood into his truck. He looked worn out. On an impulse, I asked if he wanted a coffee or snack before heading off. He paused, giving me a searching look. I half expected him to say no, but he nodded. We ended up driving together to a coffee place a few blocks away, both of us claiming we needed a break from the monotony. Inside the shop, the hum of soft music and the warm smell of espresso enveloped us. We chose a small table in the back corner, both a bit shy, as though we were doing something mildly scandalous just by being there. He asked how I met Noah, and I told him about the day I visited my cousin's campus, how I bumped into this bright, ambitious young student who seemed so sure of his path. We dated for a year, then married quickly, believing love would solve everything. Mark listened quietly, sipping his coffee, glancing at me now and then with a mix of empathy and caution. I, in turn, asked about his life. He was vague about details, only saying he'd been married in his 20s, and it ended badly. He travelled for work after that, never settling until a friend recommended this duplex. Something about the way he downplayed his past spoke volumes. I sensed he was protecting himself. We kept talking. Time slipped by. We realised the shop was closing soon. As we headed back to the truck, the evening sky glowed with the last hints of sunset. He offered me a ride home. I accepted without hesitation. The short drive felt like a silent acknowledgement of something building between us. When we reached our adjoining driveways, we sat in the truck for a moment before either of us spoke. There was a charged hush. Finally, he cleared his throat, said something about how he'd better get going, that he had an early morning. I nodded, heart pounding. We parted with a simple good night. Days turned into a pattern of chance meetings, quiet conversations, and an unspoken pull that drew us closer. Until one night, everything changed irrevocably. It was a warm Friday. Noah was yet again off at a conference. I'd had a restless day at work, an argument with a co-worker about shift coverage. My frustration spilled over, and I came home feeling hollow. Poppy, our cat, meowed for attention, but the apartment felt claustrophobic. I stood by the window, watching the lights in Mark's half of the duplex. A swirl of confusion and longing welled up in me. Before I could overthink it, I found myself texting him, something casual. "Tough day. Hope you're doing okay." A few minutes later, he replied, "Rough day for me too. You want to talk?" I was at his door within 10 minutes. He opened it, wearing a loose t-shirt and jeans, looking both apprehensive and concerned. He ushered me into his living room. I noticed how his furniture was sparse but cosy. An old couch, some scattered tools near the corner, shelves with worn paperbacks. My heart pounded, realising the intimacy of stepping into his private space for the first time. He asked if I wanted anything, water, tea, a beer. I chose water, my throat suddenly dry. We talked. At first it was just venting about our respective rough days. But soon, deeper truths slipped out. I confessed how lonely I felt, how my marriage seemed to be drifting. He opened up a bit about his regrets, how he'd burned bridges in his youth, how at 50 he felt he'd missed chances for real happiness. The mood shifted from friendly to something far more vulnerable. At one point, I noticed tears slipping down my cheeks. He handed me a tissue, his gaze full of sympathy, that I hadn't received from anyone in a long time. A hush fell. We sat on the couch side by side, the soft lamp lighting half his face in gentle shadows. My breath caught when his hand found mine. Warmth radiated from that simple contact, stirring something deep within me. I should have pulled away. I should have remembered my vows. But in that moment, the emotional current was too strong. Our eyes locked. His hand tightened around mine. We leaned closer. The first kiss was tentative, almost questioning. When I didn't recoil, he kissed me again, more intently. My mind screamed about crossing lines, but my body responded with an urgency that felt unstoppable. We never spoke about ages, about the blatant taboo of a married 22-year-old woman turning to a 50-year-old neighbour. We simply gave in to the wave of want that had been building for weeks. There was no grand seduction, no explicit negotiation of what we were doing. It happened in an unspoken, breathless moment that left us both trembling. For a while afterward, we sat there, the reality sinking in. My wedding ring felt like it weighed a ton. I mumbled something about how I needed to leave. He looked torn, as though wanting to say more, but not sure if he should. I left quietly, slipping back into my own half of the duplex. Once inside, I sank to the floor, heart pounding with a mix of exhilaration and horror. I'd just betrayed Noah in the most profound way, yet I couldn't deny the rush of feeling truly alive, like a door to colour and warmth had opened in my otherwise grey existence. Over the following days, I tried to pretend nothing had changed. I avoided Mark whenever possible, leaving for work earlier, returning home later, half hoping we could revert to being polite neighbours. But the memory of his kiss haunted me. Meanwhile, Noah came back from his conference, weary but cheerful about some success in his research. I attempted to engage him in conversation, but it felt forced, as though a wall stood between us. My guilt festered, fueling an odd resentment. I blamed him for not being there, for not seeing me, even though I knew my own actions were indefensible. Eventually, Mark texted me, asking if we could talk. I tried ignoring him, but the tension was too heavy. One evening, I found myself sneaking over to his side of the duplex again, my pulse racing as I knocked softly on his door. He let me in, concern etched in his features. We sat in his living room, a silent question hanging between us. What are we doing? I told him we had to stop, that this was wrong. He nodded, gaze full of regret, but also honesty. He said he respected any decision I made, yet neither of us moved. The hush stretched out, thick with longing. I felt tears, frustration, and the pull of something I couldn't articulate. Then, as if magnetically drawn, we reached for each other again. This time, the closeness was more deliberate. We wrapped our arms around each other, surrendering to the current. In the haze of that moment, all I felt was relief, as if I'd found a lifeline in a stormy sea. And he, for his part, seemed equally unable to hold back. Our affair began in earnest. We navigated it with secrecy and adrenaline. Whenever Noah was away or busy, I'd slip to Mark's side for a few stolen hours of intimacy and quiet conversation. We tried to keep it measured. No public displays, no obvious signs. But our neighbourhood was small, and I worried people might notice how often I spent time with him. Still, the emotional void in my marriage overshadowed the risks. Mark was a balm to my loneliness, his presence steady, his attention unwavering. A man with decades more life experience, who somehow understood my restlessness. Of course, the guilt weighed heavily. There were nights I'd lie beside Noah, hearing his soft breathing, wondering how I'd become the sort of person who led a double life. My younger self would have been appalled, but the daily reality of our marriage felt hollow. He was lost in academic pursuits, I was lost in confusion. Mark offered me a warmth I'd long craved, and in the swirl of it all, I let moral lines fade. Inevitably, cracks began to show. Noah started sensing my distracted nature. I'd come home with a faint flush, or I'd be texting surreptitiously, half smiling at my phone. He'd ask if everything was okay. I'd say I was tired or stressed. We bickered more often, small arguments about chores or finances that flared up with unspoken tensions. Mark, too, felt uneasy. Once he admitted he was scared of hurting me, of being the reason my marriage fell apart. I had no reassurance to offer. We both knew we'd gone too far to pretend it meant nothing. The breaking point came when Noah came home early from campus, surprising me and Mark in our kitchen. We weren't entangled in anything overt, just standing too close, exchanging a look that was unmistakably intimate. Noah froze at the threshold, eyes darting between us. I leaped back, face draining of colour, stammering some excuse about Mark helping with a leaky faucet. But the tension was obvious, the way my hands shook, the faint catch in my voice. Mark, equally flustered, mumbled that he should go. He brushed past Noah, who made no move to stop him, too stunned to react. As soon as Mark left, Noah turned to me, voice raw with betrayal. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. My heart hammered, tears already forming. I tried to speak, but all that emerged was a choked admission. "I'm sorry." That single phrase said enough. Noah's face contorted with hurt and anger. He shouted, asking how long, how could I do this, why with someone old enough to be my father? I couldn't answer. It was as if all the unspoken resentments burst out into the open, how I'd felt ignored, how he was consumed by his studies, how we never truly connected anymore. But no explanation could justify the lie I'd been living. He stormed out, slamming the door. The days afterward were a blur of anguish. I called him, texted him, tried to apologize in 1,000 ways, but he refused to speak. Eventually, he returned to pack up some clothes, scarcely glancing at me as he shoved items into a duffel bag. He said he needed time, that I had destroyed his trust. I sat on the couch, tears streaming down my face, as he walked out. Mark texted me, asking if I was all right. I couldn't bring myself to reply. I knew I needed to face the fallout of my choices, to see if my marriage could be salvaged at all. In the wake of that confrontation, Mark kept a respectful distance. I missed him with a painful ache, but the guilt was overwhelming. My life became an emotional wreck. Work was agony, home was worse. Sometimes in the quiet evenings, I thought of the warmth I'd shared with Mark and felt a pang of